Hello, everybody. We're just going to give folks a minute or two to kind of get settled in. But welcome to our webinar on supporting young people with transition. So yeah, come in, get comfy, and we'll start on the material very shortly. Oh, it's literally just stopped raining where I am. I don't know about yourselves.
Just checked. Still going here.
Oh no.
It's just stopped for me, but I think it's going to start again soon by the look of these clouds, to be honest.
Yeah. I can see a little bit of blue sky, a little bit, but it's very cold looking. It's very like that, like very pale blue. Yeah. Yesterday was beautiful though. Did you see the sun yesterday?
It was so beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm. Again, welcome for anyone who's just joined us. We're just letting people come in, settle down, and then we'll get going. Again, this is our webinar on supporting young people with transition. Thinking about all kinds of transition. So from year 6 to year 7, but also thinking about that key stage 3 to key stage 4 transition and that year 11 to year 12 as well.
Just had a comment in the chat from someone about their webinar, their webcam not connecting. Absolutely no problems. You don't need to have your camera on, and I'll just be monitoring people during the meeting to make sure microphones are switched off.
Perfect. All right. Well, I think if we all get started here, obviously anyone else is still welcome to join us, and they can just kind of catch up as we go. So, on with the show.
So, hi everyone. My name is Kate Pulford. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a senior education mental health practitioner.
Hi everybody, my name is Bert. I use they them pronouns, and I'm also a senior education mental health practitioner.
Hi there, I'm Jane. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an assistant education mental health practitioner.
So we're part of the Trafford Thriving Education team, which is the mental health support team. So we're part of NHS CAMHS, but we're based within secondary schools and colleges across Trafford. We support staff, students and families in 3 different ways. So the first being whole school approach. That can be through workshops or assemblies or parent coffee mornings, trying to kind of reach that universal audience of students or staff or families. We also have advice and guidance. So the schools and settings that we're in, we will come into for a consultation once or twice a half term, where young people can be brought and discussed about potential options for support. One of those options being low intensity work with one of our practitioners. So we work with mild to moderate mental health difficulties for about 6 to 8 sessions taking place weekly, and they're really focused on a presentation. So it could be anxiety or low mood or emotional regulation. So that's who we are in a nutshell, in case anybody wasn't sure.
Thanks, Kate. And in terms of what to expect today, so this webinar is being recorded. It should, fingers crossed, be automatically sent to you afterwards. You should get a link once it's published. I'm aware that there have been quite a few internet difficulties today, and technology can sometimes be a bit fickle, but that's what we'll try and do. If you don't receive a link to the recording or kind of something goes wrong with that, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll try and get you sorted. And then in terms of what we're going to cover today, we're going to be thinking about transition from a mental health and wellbeing perspective. We're going to be reflecting on how your setting supports young people to manage transitions in education, and we're going to be thinking about some practical strategies to support young people to transition well. So kind of introducing this framework around mental health and well-being and what that can look like when it comes to transition, And then thinking specifically about kind of what happens in your setting, maybe sharing some examples of best practice or doing a bit of problem solving around any kind of dilemmas or questions that have come up for you. And then we'll kind of get into some real practical strategies, some things that you can think about, which might be especially useful if you're someone who's responsible for coordinating transition in your setting, or you're someone who's expecting to be working with a lot of year 7 students, or a lot of year 12 students, or year 6 students, or year 11 students, or something like that. As we go through today, feel free to pop questions in the chat. Jane will be kind of monitoring that. We've also got a Q&A feature, I believe, so feel free to use that. You can also kind of raise a hand and speak if you'd like, and then we'll just kind of go through the slides, and as I say, being recorded and will hopefully be automatically sent to you afterwards. We're aware that there'll be lots of different people in the room today, a variety of attendees from different settings, so kind of take what's useful for you, and kind of just try and approach the material and kind of think about, okay, how could I apply this in my work and what we're doing. All right.
So firstly, we're going to be looking at the link between experiencing a transition within education and a mental health presentation. I'm sure any of you working within education has seen that those kind of experiencing a transition can also experience a mental health presentation, and that change can really influence us and impact us. So thinking about the changes and the differences between education settings and what changes young people might experience as they move from primary to secondary or secondary to further education. I guess it's going from what's completely familiar and comfortable to something that's completely different. So it could be a new schedule, new peers, a new building, completely new staff. And I guess the change I'm thinking about kind of primary to secondary, having one member of staff in primary school that you have day in, day out, one classroom, and then going to having multiple different members of staff for different subjects, different classrooms, having to navigate a new building or multiple buildings, experiencing new subjects or new courses. There's that increase in academic pressure kind of as soon as you step foot in a high school. New facilities and equipment, and I guess that increased independence or an expectation of a certain independence that you might not have had in a primary school or in a secondary school if you're moving towards that further education. And as well, I think for primary school, year 6s, if you think they're going from being the biggest and the oldest, and they're really familiar and really comfortable, to then going to being the youngest again, and quite often being the smallest in a really big, overwhelming environment. So just some things to kind of consider when we're thinking about the changes.
And in terms of kind of taking that change and kind of putting it within a mental health framework, we often describe transition as a kind of a double threat. So on the one hand, we have a reduced resilience. So that might mean that someone hasn't got the coping strategies that they've previously established, either because they don't work in the new setting or they're not available. They might have had a loss of support network, so they might have had staff they've had really good relationships with, or peers they've had really good relationships with, and they're not carrying those forward to the new setting. They might be missing support structures or reasonable adjustments. Obviously, we'll talk a bit later on about communication between settings, but that isn't always possible, and it might mean that something that was in place at a young person's primary school or secondary school isn't then there when they move on to their next setting. And then because of that, they might have fewer opportunities to feel good about themselves or to meet their own needs. So they're not as able to kind of get the joy that they may be experiencing from social interactions. They might not feel kind of, Kate was talking about the idea of sometimes as a year 6, you might feel like you really know stuff about school. You might be in this really confident, capable place. And you're going to have opportunities then to feel good about yourself or meet your own needs in terms of, you'll be able to help others. You'll be able to kind of see yourself within that role. So those are some of the ways in which someone might experience a reduced resilience. And then on the other hand, there's new challenges to face. We might see an increase in pressure or higher stakes. Generally, as people move through our education system in the UK, things start to feel more and more pressured, particularly around academic achievement and attainment. Things like GCSEs, A-levels can feel like an increased pressure or higher stakes. There might be an expectation to be more self-reliant, become more independent as a learner. You might be being asked to organize your own studying more, or kind of, there might be more in the role of homework or work outside of school. It's an unfamiliar environment with unfamiliar people. And there are lots of threats to kind of your self-identity. So you kind of, who you think you are has kind of changed, and that can be quite challenging. So in essence, what we're saying is that a young person might be in this position of being less able to cope, but also have more to cope with. And then together those combine to create a risk of reduced well-being. So that's the kind of framework that we'll be kind of thinking about and using today, this idea of reduced resilience plus new challenges gives us that risk of reduced well-being. So that's the kind of two areas we'll be looking to intervene on when we get to our practical strategies. As Kate mentioned earlier, we are a CBT service. The low intensity intervention that we offer is CBT. So just to kind of, to bring some of these changes within that model, CBT is all about the relationship between how we think, feel, and behave. So when we are transitioning from one setting to another, we might have a lot of negative predictions. A lot of our thoughts might be quite negative about the setting. We might feel things like grief, anxiety, sadness, resentment, anger. And then there might be a lot of changes to our behavior. So, we might maybe previously our routine in the mornings had us up at 7 and out the door at 8. But now our new school is a lot further away, or maybe I'm getting the tram there, or, things have changed about my behavior that might be within my control, or might have been outside of my control. So I might have to stop some activities, I might need to start some activities. And so there's all these opportunities for someone to slip into a pattern that could be quite negative for their mental health. And that's kind of what we'll look at in specific over the next couple of slides.
So I guess the main presentations we're going to be looking at, and presentations that you might see as staff in education, is low mood and anxiety. So we'll just look at the low mood cycle. So this is what we look at in CBT. So it's called the vicious cycle of low mood. So it starts with feeling low, and that can lead to feeling unmotivated and not feeling like you have any energy, and therefore you kind of do less activity. And that leads to feeling like you're not getting that achievement feeling out of life. So you feel like you're getting less out of life, which leads to you feeling low, which leads to you not wanting to do as much. And it can just be really hard to kind of break out of that cycle. And I think when young people are transitioning throughout education, that can be a really big time where I guess they stop doing things generally. Maybe it's the club that they attended is not being ran at high school, or they're a bit too nervous to attend. So generally that's where we see a drop off in young people kind of doing less activity. And I guess what comes along with that is those negative beliefs that can kind of reinforce feeling low. So I guess thoughts about how they're being perceived by others. So thinking that nobody likes you, thinking that they don't have the opportunity to feel good. So thinking my life's rubbish, and also thinking that they're not able to do those things if they are presented with an opportunity. So thinking that they're useless, thinking they can't do anything. So getting stuck in that cycle can become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy by kind of thinking they can't do anything and therefore not putting themselves forward to kind of engage in those activities, which will therefore impact their mood. And then the second really common presentation is anxiety, and this is called the avoidance cycle. So I guess this mainly comes about when there's a element of uncertainty for a young person or for anybody. So we start to feel anxious, and those feelings are really uncomfortable, and they can be really hard to cope with. So generally people who feel anxious have this tendency to want to avoid that situation. In the short term, that will make them feel better because they get rid of those really uncomfortable anxiety feelings. And that reinforces the belief that that was kind of the correct thing to do, was to avoid that situation. But in the long term, that kind of reinforces that anxiety. So that can be especially difficult for young people who are experiencing or going through transition within education, because there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of opportunity to be negative about possible experiences. So for example, if I introduce myself to people, they'll laugh at me. If I raise my hand, I might get the question wrong. Not being able to cope with really loud places like the canteen. And I guess with this one as well, it can become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if a young person is nervous about meeting new people or going to clubs because they think nobody's going to like them and they're not going to make any friends, that can lead them to want to avoid situations like going to clubs or speaking to new people. They might avoid eye contact and they might kind of isolate themselves within school. That'll make them feel better, but it reinforces the belief that nobody wants to be friends with them. And then they don't really have the opportunity to make friends. So it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy with that anxiety avoidance cycle.
Thank you, Kate. So as Kate's kind of just taking you through, those are some really common mental health presentations and how those kind of patterns can be triggered or kind of relate to transition. The other thing that we wanted to mention is EBSNA, or emotionally based school or college non-attendance, which is a term used to describe young people who are experiencing emotionally based barriers to education that are making it difficult or impossible for them to attend their setting. I don't want to say too much on this. We've got our January webinar is being co-run with the co-facilitated by the Educational Psychologist Service, and it's all about kind of EBSNA. But just to say, it is something to be thinking about and to be holding in mind as we're kind of talking about the impact of kind of reduced resilience and new challenge and how that can make school or college feel overwhelming. How can that can then lead to young people feeling demotivated, disengaged, can cause stress, frustration, anxiety, can associate school or college with this really negative experience, this really challenging experience, lots and lots of really stressful, difficult feelings, and it can then lead to general avoidance of the school setting and make it really difficult for a young person to kind of engage with their learning and attend. So yeah, if that's something you'd like to know more about, please do come along to our January webinar. Yeah, learn a bit more. All right.
So the next section is just going to be about kind of reflecting on your setting and what opportunities there are to support young people with the transition within education. So we've got a discussion in a couple of slides, but if I can just get you to start thinking about the things that you've already got in place and kind of what's going well, that would be really good to hear in a couple of slides.
I've just posted some questions to help our thinking around that in the Q&A.
Thanks, Jane.
Thank you, Jane. So yeah, we're thinking about this double threat, this less able to cope, more to cope with. How are you kind of currently responding to that in your setting? What ways do you have of reducing challenge in an appropriate way? So we often are going to be talking about the graduated or staircase approach. So again, with that, it's not about expecting less of particular young people. It's about increasing the number of steps so that they're similarly able to achieve and they're going to get to that same height, that same level. And then in terms of increasing resilience, we're going to be thinking about making resilient moves. We're going to be thinking about that resilience framework, that idea that in order to kind of be well, to be successful, there's lots and lots of things we need. And that sometimes we can kind of increase our resiliency by looking at areas where we're not meeting our needs and kind of change things there. Sometimes, again, it can be useful to kind of reflect on what your setting is doing. And other times it can be useful to kind of even maybe reflect on kind of the experiences you've had with transition and what you've noticed among the students and staff you worked with, or even yourself when you were kind of experiencing transition. So yeah, let's have a little bit of a discussion and a little bit of a chat about what's going on in your setting. And I'll hand over to Kate for that.
Yeah, so we just thought it'd be really nice to have a discussion about what your setting is offering, what support's available to increase resilience, what support is available to reduce any challenges in the face of transition. Are there any difficulties that you've experienced or what's going really well? Yeah, we have put on here to kind of pause the recording, but we're not able to pause the recording. But if we could just be mindful not to share any identifying information about specific young people, just because this recording will be sent out to other members of staff who aren't able to attend this recording. Does anybody have anything that they wouldn't mind putting in the chat? Yeah.
Sorry, so someone's just posted in the chat that they run a transition sports club for students in year 6. And then someone else has posted that they do a transition day in June or July, and then they do a phased entry in September for a couple of hours, like a couple of hours before the rest of the school, an early lunch so that new students can get used to the canteen before the rest of the school come in, which is a really lovely idea because we know from our work in schools that that can be quite an overwhelming experience. A couple of other people are typing in the chat. The questions are in the Q&A, but if you want to use the chat and you're more comfortable with that, then that's absolutely fine. Yep, transition days, resilience sessions with the SEND team, if there are sort of students with very specific needs. Loads of fantastic responses, folks. This is great.
So it sounds like we're
Learning-
getting quite a few things around kind of that reducing challenge. That's like those things like phased entry or kind of offering things in a more graduated way. And then we've heard about some increasing resilience options. So you mentioned a sports club, and then also resilience sessions.
Yeah, and then someone has commented, I'm not sure if they work in primary or secondary, that they do learning mentor time, and they sort of are increasing that resilience through raising the expectations for year 6 students, so giving them more independence and self-reliance and giving those year 6 students extra duties.
Brilliant. So it's kind of closing that gap of the expectations, so it's not such a huge leap from primary to secondary.
Yeah, I really like this. Someone has commented that they do a residential at the end of September. That could really increase that resilience. It could also just support that connection between those new year 7 students. So yeah, lovely. Oh, thanks. Yeah, so those were things happening in primary schools, giving more expectation and learning mentoring to year 6 students. Thanks, folks. That's fab.
Brilliant. And I think I read one that popped up, I can't remember who it was, sorry, about doing something in form time for the first half term, which I really like the idea of, because it's not that there's a lot of work that goes into preparing students for that transition, but actually once they're in school, that those kind of worries don't disappear. So I think that's really really nice to do a bit of that wraparound care once they're in school, to help them feel more settled.
Agreed, because what we know about transition is that it's a process rather than just sort of a one-off event. So thanks everyone for your input and your feedback to those questions there. That's great.
Perfect. Right. I mean, obviously feel free to continue to discuss anything that that's brought up, but it sounds like there's some really good work going on there. So yeah, if we start thinking about some strategies.
Yeah, and I guess we're going to be thinking now about practical steps to support young people to transition well. And obviously, it's something that you all know if you're involved in supporting young people, preparing them for transition or supporting them after they've kind of moved up to your setting. And I guess what we like to ask people to think about is their own experiences of a transition. So that could be to a new job, to a new area, even if you can think back to when you transitioned within school, just kind of holding in mind what went well for you and what helped you. And I think it can be really helpful to relate back to our own experiences so we can kind of put ourselves in the young people's shoes, and it makes it a little bit more relatable for us.
So the first thing we're going to be thinking about is setting familiarization. So obviously it's something that's already come up. A lot of people have talked about kind of visiting days or sort of evenings or after school events for kind of new students, or kind of maybe even in the summer holidays, kind of new student experiences. And I think it's useful to think, if you're kind of someone who's organizing some of that work for your setting, is to think about what kind of questions are young people going to have, and what do we mean by familiarization? What kinds of things do we want them to get familiar with? So we've just kind of broken that down a little bit on this slide. So there's a lot of sensory kind of questions that a young person might have, or a lot of sensory familiarization that you might want to be thinking about. So, what does my new setting look like? What does it smell like? What does it sound like? What's the furniture like? What is my uniform going to feel like? Some of that kind of familiarization is things that you might want to have happen through the young person visiting the setting. Other parts can maybe be done elsewhere, kind of thinking about could they try their uniform on in kind of different experiences or different settings, and kind of, yeah, thinking about that sensory familiarization. And we've got familiarization with processes. So what is the routine of the school day? What are the expectations on me? How do I ask for help? What happens if I get something wrong? And again, those are things that maybe the familiarization process can start earlier or can look a bit different. So someone might try and align their routine. One of the settings that I work in, the sort of timetable for students changes prior to the summer holidays. That last half term, they change the timetable then. So when they're thinking about that Key Stage 3 to GCSE transition, that Key Stage 3 to Key Stage 4, young people are starting that new timetable. They're starting those kind of new subjects that almost half a term early, to already start getting used to that new routine, start getting used to that new timetable. And we've got familiarization around place. Where is this setting? How do I get there? Where do I enter? What door do I use? Where are the classrooms? Where are the toilets? Where are the places for eating? Where are the places for socializing? Both in a kind of official sense, but also in a sense of, where do people go? How do people actually use this space? And then obviously familiarization with people. So, which of my friends are going with me? What are the other students like? What are the other staff like? So kind of trying to break down when you're planning transition familiarization, what questions are you trying to answer for the students and how are you going to make sure that they get that information they need? And in terms of kind of answering all those questions at once, that might work perfectly well for some students, but could also be overwhelming for others. So there might be particular students that you've identified who might need more of a graduated approach. And again, that's all something that you can plan with individual students, or kind of thinking about whether there's a specific group of students that perhaps young people with NSEN, or young people that have put themselves forward, or that you've kind of offered kind of a pre-registration to, or something like that. And then you can kind of, for example, if the task was visiting a new setting, a graduated approach could look like providing some information about the setting. So watching a video, looking at it on the website, reading a brochure, looking at a flyer or a pamphlet, something like that. Then completing a task associated with the new setting, something like sourcing a new uniform, filling out a form or doing some paperwork, thinking about supplies or stationery, doing some kind of preparation task perhaps, and then actually preparing to visit the setting. So that could be working out a route, practicing timings or routines, and then visiting the new setting. And in terms of a graduated approach, this would be kind of a plan that you could offer to support that young person and kind of get them to kind of do these step-by-step things that would then build up to that. In terms of getting that level of challenge right, you might want to kind of understand what the young person might find easier or more difficult. If there's something that kind of, then they've already identified that there's something that they feel quite confident at or quite capable, you might need to kind of do fewer steps in that area. And then if it's something they're finding more difficult, you'd kind of increase the frequency of steps. And then, yeah, asking a trusted person to join or support a step can often reduce the kind of difficulty level of that. And then you could repeat it again without that person present. And just gradually increase the number of steps needed until each step feels manageable for the young person. And then again, if you're kind of responsible for transition coordination, you want to be thinking about developing relationships. Successfully forming positive relationships can be really key to transitioning well. So you want to be thinking about what are the opportunities for young people to meet each other? What are the opportunities for new students to meet setting staff? And what are the opportunities for you to get to know new students and their families? So in terms of ways to meet each other, that could be open evenings, it could be coffee mornings, it could be activity afternoons, whatever works well for you in your setting and your staffing capabilities. Then you want to be thinking about kind of your information sharing or handover. So, do you ask new students to fill out an All About Me form? If you've got a new form tutors, do they fill out any information? Are they sharing anything about themselves to, again, help that relationship to develop, help that relationship to grow? Sometimes it's just really useful to know, okay, this is my new form tutor. Here's a picture of what they look like. And here's, 2 languages they speak and their favorite food or something like that, just to, again, open the door to that relationship. And then again, if you're kind of leading on transition coordination, you want to be thinking about how you're soliciting and reviewing information from previous settings. Or if you're a setting that people are transitioning from, you want to be thinking about how you're providing information from about a young person to their next setting, and kind of thinking about what that looks like, how you're ensuring that that information is accurate, high quality, making sure that you've kind of everybody understands in terms of consent and confidentiality, what kind of information you're going to be sharing, and what form that's going to take. Another thing to think about in the kind of developing relationships arena could be about named students or staff that kind of are really key for developing those relationships. So sometimes in some settings they have kind of a peer mentor scheme, or they might have ambassador students. So students who've maybe received a little bit of training or have been given a bit of a role to be really welcoming for new students to the school. Maybe it's some year eights who can kind of make themselves available for year sevens to come say hi to. Sometimes it's just students that are going to have some training about kind of making people feel really welcome, or kind of maybe de-escalating tricky social situations, or kind of again just being a bit of an ambassador. And for some families, you might want them to start to identify a support worker or a key worker or a member of staff who's going to be really important for their experience of that school, and for that relationship to again start developing early. So if you're kind of thinking about, okay, how are these relationships going to be forming? How can I make sure that person A connects with person B? And then also something that comes up quite a lot in quite a lot of the settings that I work in is thinking about how that adjustment period is going to look. So as Kate's mentioned, as we already talked about, a lot of effort can go into preparing somebody for transition, and then sometimes that effort can kind of fall off when they arrive at their new setting. So kind of thinking about what opportunities are you giving young people to learn what's expected of them at their new setting, and how is that looking like? What are the ways that you could maybe be really proactive, but ensuring that people are able to meet your expectations, and kind of thinking about how that can be done in a really positive way, in a really collaborative way, not one that feels really punitive. Sometimes we get students who are really, really anxious about kind of what rules are going to look like at their new setting, or you might get students that have that really quickly establish like maybe a negative reputation, or things can just feel like they're really confrontational right from the beginning. So kind of thinking about how you could approach things differently, thinking about de-escalating mistakes. So if someone isn't following a rule, how can we get them to be following the rule or displaying the behavior you want to see as quickly as possible? How can we maybe remain calm, take emotion out of it, and move towards the outcome that we want to see? Celebrating success. A lot of my settings do this in lots and lots of different ways, but particularly around kind of new learners. So your new year sevens, maybe your new year 12s, kind of thinking about how can we really show what good looks like? How can we allow people to learn from the good? And how can we celebrate the students that are doing well? How can we model what a good student looks like for our young people? Having consistent, clear expectations with predictable outcomes, and building in early detection mechanisms to behaviour, attendance, and attainment policies. So again, not necessarily taking a punitive approach, but having a real awareness of how you can use kind of maybe data about attendance or data about attainment to really proactively respond and kind of say to somebody, okay, this person seems to have been late 3 times this term. Let's have a meeting. Let's sit down with them. Let's figure out what's going on here. Let me kind of investigate this a bit further. Let me explore. Let me kind of understand. And trying to do that with a real kind of attitude of I want to know more about what's getting in the way for this young person, and I want to come up with a kind of a plan. So yeah, just some thinking about how you're giving your new students that grace, and how you're allowing them to learn, and how you're allowing them to move forward quickly. And again, that could look like planned review meetings sometimes. So in some of my settings, there'll be a very early kind of check-in with a maybe with their form tutor, or again in the later years, you might want to be thinking about how can you ensure that a young person has adjusted to kind of a different style of learning, making sure they're not getting really behind on kind of a coursework element, or that they're not feeling really overwhelmed. And so again, early kind of review, early detection of problems where possible. All right, over to you, Kate.
So I guess we're just going to be thinking now about how to support young people and students to build that confidence and build on their self-esteem, which I guess during transitions might be more reduced when they're faced with kind of uncertainty and new situations. It's also about kind of building that resilience as well, which we know can also kind of be reduced during transitions. So a useful model to kind of think about is the learning model. So some of you may be aware of this, so I'm just going to go through it just in case anybody hasn't seen it before. So we've got the comfort zone, and I guess young people who have been in year 6 or year 11, their comfort zone might be, their primary school. They're feeling familiar, they feel really secure, they feel really comfortable, they know exactly what's going on. It's really certain situation for them. We've got the learning zone, where young people might start to feel a little bit more challenged. There's more expectations placed on them. They might be anticipating a little bit more and wondering a little bit more about what's going to happen. But also there can be a sense of excitement because it's something new, and it can be exhilarating as well. We've then got the panic zone, which is where we're feeling overwhelmed, feeling quite stressed. We might feel quite frustrated, fearful, tense, upset, anxious, exhausted, unmotivated. So young people that stay within that comfort zone never have a chance to push themselves, to learn new things, and to reach that learning zone. Equally, if a young person is in the panic zone, they're really going to struggle to learn new things. They're in fight or flight, their thinking, rational brain is not switched on, and it's just their emotions taking over. So if you think about a time when maybe you were panicking or feeling frustrated or stressed or tired or angry, it's really not the time to kind of sit down and try and learn something new or learn a new skill, because our emotions have just taken over. So being in the learning zone is where we want young people to be, because it allows us to build our confidence in new areas. So if you think about a time where maybe you did something for the first time and it was quite anxiety provoking, I always think about the first time that I drove a car, or did my first driving lesson. That was quite anxiety provoking, but because I kind of stayed in that learning zone and carried on and practiced, it's now something that has become a comfort zone for me, and I feel really confident in that. So kind of moving from the learning zone to the comfort zone can really help young people build their confidence in different areas. Just some things to bear in mind when we're encouraging young people to move between into the learning zone. I guess being able to tolerate some discomfort, and that can be really hard for a lot of young people. It's not always easy to do new things, to speak to new people, to try new clubs. It can be really uncomfortable, it can be really nerve-wracking, it can be really frustrating, and it can be a test of resilience. So I guess if you've got a student who's kind of expressing those uncomfortable feelings when they're trying something new, just normalize how they're feeling. It's really normal to feel that way. It could be relevant for you to validate how they're feeling. You could maybe reference it by saying something that you've experienced that you were first anxious to try, but it's actually something that you enjoy now, and it's something that you feel really confident in. So yeah, just normalizing that there is a bit of discomfort that comes with trying new things. The second one is to be able to regulate those heightened emotions. So if somebody is kind of tipping into that panic zone, and you can see that they're becoming dysregulated, allowing that student to take time to regulate, take a minute and to breathe. We're not necessarily removing them from that comfort zone, because like I said, that's not where they learn, and they're not kind of learning their resilience, and they're not learning that they can cope with things, with new things and new experiences. But we want them to not be in the panic zone. So we want to try and help them to regulate, so that they can move back down to the learning zone, so that their rational brain is switched back on and they're able to kind of approach the learning. I guess young people might already have an idea of what helps them to regulate. If they're a bit younger, they might not know. So I guess it's something to kind of you or a member of staff to support them in, or parents, support them in discovering what works for them in terms of regulating. Remaining supportive and compassionate, and also I think reminding young people that it's okay if things don't go exactly to plan, kind of ties in with that uncertainty and that uncomfortable feeling. It's how we learn best if things don't always go to plan. Again, it can be a good test of resilience. If a young person has experienced something new, even if the outcome wasn't exactly what they wanted, I still think that should be celebrated. It's good experience for them to try new things, and it should be a relatively positive way to reflect, I guess, on something that they've achieved. So just trying to view every situation that they've put themselves in, any new situation, as a positive, even if it hasn't been quite what they wanted in terms of the outcome. Make it into a habit. So I guess stepping into the learning zone becomes easier the more practice you have. So again, those younger students might not have much experience of trying something new, or going to a new club or speaking to new people. But I guess the more they do it, the easier it will become. And then they have a reference point. If they can recall a time where they tried a club in primary school and that went really well, they can maybe think about how that could also go well if they try something new in the future. It might be that you have students that are able to kind of move to that learning zone really easily, but for others, I guess what Bert was saying as well, that graduated approach, they might need smaller steps and have more time in the comfort zone afterwards to kind of recover. And I guess thinking about how the young person can move to the learning zone, it's all about learning what works best for them. And I think the best way to do that is just sit down with them and ask how they're feeling, and maybe even go through the model with the young person and see if they can recognise when they're in the learning zone, situations where they feel they're most comfortable and confident, and situations which maybe would put them in the panic zone. So yeah, going through this model with them can be really useful because they can map it out and make it relevant to them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's kind of Kate's alluded to at the end there, kind of where these things are done in collaboration with the young person is what's going to help keep them in the learning zone rather than the panic zone. If they have that sense of agency, if they feel like they know what's happening and that they're in control of kind of how much they're kind of stepping into these new experiences and having a go, that's much more likely to feel exciting or to feel, yeah, this is I can do this. I feel good rather than kind of being thrown in the deep end or feeling out of control, which is much more likely to make us feel overwhelmed. So again, just getting that kind of collaboration. And in terms of kind of establishing that with a young person, so kind of thinking about how to make your classroom a space where emotions are discussed, being curious about young people, trying to notice changes. Obviously, it can be really difficult when you've got a classroom full of new students who you kind of you don't know, or you feel like you don't know what makes them tick. So kind of figuring out how you're going to learn more about them, whether that is through getting them to sort of write things down, to fill in kind of forms or worksheets around themselves, to introduce themselves, or whether it's going to be a case of kind of, really picking up that information from the previous setting. So thinking about how can you find out more about what they're like. And I guess we've got this diagram that we use in quite a lot of our presentations, which is just about kind of picking your moment and understanding that usually people need to first regulate. So if someone is kind of distressed, we need to kind of bring them back to a level. We need to kind of reassure them. We need to relate to them. We need to kind of keep them feeling safe, feeling that it's okay. So it might look like saying something like, "Thank you for sharing that with me. I'm really glad you told me about that. I think it's really brave to open up." So something that kind of shores up the relationship that you have between that young person and yourself, and then moving on to that reasoning, moving on to that planning, thinking about what the next step is of, okay, so it sounds like you're having a lot of trouble kind of getting into school in the mornings. Are there some things that we could try? Are there some strategies that we could put in place that might make that a bit easier for you? Would you be willing to kind of give that a go? And then, sometimes it can be a useful activity if you have got kind of a student that is experiencing a lot of distress, or that you've noticed seems to be really struggling with the transition. It's kind of understanding what factors are going into that, so you can kind of understand where you might be able to bring in some resilience technique. So if you're kind of doing a type of activity like a stress bucket activity where you're kind of identifying where are my stresses coming from, and actually the young person's written down that, dad's really poorly and there's troubles with housing and my little sister's keeping me up all night, then you're kind of thinking, okay, this young person's maybe got a lot going on outside of the school environment and they might need some support in that area before they're able to engage with learning, before they're able to transition well. And kind of it can help you to think about what's going on in this young person's life, what kind of problems are they experiencing, and just give a sort of more holistic picture. And then you can also think with the young person about kind of what their coping strategies are, and how they kind of regulate themselves, how they manage to release stress, and what they can kind of do to relieve that. So yeah, it could just be a useful activity to do with a young person.
So we're kind of coming. Oh,
sorry.
I'll go for it.
You go, Kate.
We're coming towards the end of our webinar today. We just thought we'd put in some services to be aware of. I'm sure lots of you will be aware of them anyway, but they can be really useful just to kind of bear in mind, or sometimes just have a bit of a reminder of the services that are out there, because there are many. But yeah, it can be useful just to bear in mind if you've got a young person that's struggling or a family that are struggling.
Thanks.
The first one is the educational psychologists have put together a Padlet based around EBSNA. There's lots and lots of different resources on there. So if you wanted to have a little look and see if any of them would be relevant or share with families, there's lots of things on there. There's also support that can be accessed anytime, really flexible support for children and young people. There's Shout, there's Kooth, and there's Childline. Kooth and Childline also have websites with lots of different mental health and emotional wellbeing activities, and there's also moderated forums on there as well.
There's also lots of kind of groups and drop-ins available for young people. So 42nd Street run quite a few groups, and they are still open for self-referrals from young people. Trafford Talk Shop, which is based on the ground floor of the Sale Waterside building, runs a lot of activities. Gorse Hill Studios over in Stretford do a lot of work. And one thing that I always like to shout out in any kind of webinar is the Trafford Directory. So that's www.trafforddirectory.co.uk. So they're a really, really good resource for finding out what's available in Trafford. They're a really comprehensive directory of lots and lots of different services and organisations. You can type anything in and kind of see what's available, and that can be really useful. And then also just being aware of kind of various parent and carer support. So another thing that I'm regularly signposting people to is the Counselling and Family Centre in Altrincham are running I'm a Parent, Get Me Out of Here courses. Those are fully funded for parents with children at Trafford schools. So it's always good to signpost some people to something that's free, but is also really kind of comprehensive and can be really useful. And then just some other kind of things on there, as well as the Trafford Family Help Padlet, which is accessible by following that QR code. And then obviously also within Trafford, we have lots of specific support. Things like the Greater Manchester Autism Consortium, Trafford Sleep Services, the Proud Trust, Trafford Young Carers, things like that. We also run a school and colleges information line. So if you're looking for a specific kind of support and you can't find what you need in the directory, you can contact us for advice. You can ask us if we've heard of a specific support service, or if you've got a kind of a dilemma about a young person, you can contact us and book in a consultation, and we can kind of talk you through what we're aware of and what we know, which can sometimes be useful. Yeah, so that's also something to kind of bear in mind there. And these are just sort of slides you can come back to, sources of support that you can kind of refer back to over the year as things go.
So just before we ask for any questions, we'll just ask you to complete a feedback form if possible, or we can have ask questions while people are filling in the feedback form. Jane's put the link in the chat, and there's also a QR code on there that you can scan. But yeah, while people are filling that out, does anybody have any questions, or has any questions come up in the chat, Jane?
No questions that have come up in the chat as yet, but we'll give people a couple of minutes to just write any questions or comments in there.
Thank you, Jane.
We do also have a transition toolkit that we can send out. If you complete the feedback form and leave your email, we can send that toolkit out. It is mainly aimed at the transition between primary to secondary, but I'm sure those kind of activities can be adapted for those older young people who are transitioning to further education.
Additionally, if you're joining us from a setting that we work in, you can always contact your lead practitioner and ask for some support around transition, or if you want us to get involved in some of the kind of whole school approach or whole setting approach activities that you're kind of got going on, yeah, please discuss that with us. I know we do get very booked up because everybody wants something at the same time, which is very understandable. But yeah, do have those conversations with your practitioner and do kind of get that scheduled and booked in when you can.
Perfect. So just double checking whether there were any questions at all before we kind of move on to closing this session.
No questions have popped up in the chat. A couple of people just saying thank you, which is lovely to hear.
Thank you. All right. Well, in that case, I'll sort of move us on to our kind of end. Again, please do let us know any comments, any suggestions in the feedback form. We read all of the feedback forms and we try and take the feedback on board. So please let us know what you thought, and let us know kind of how we can make these webinars as useful as they can possibly be. In terms of the webinars for next term, we will have the links out as soon as we can. So please check our social media for any updates. And again, if you're one of our allocated settings, then just talk to your practitioner and they'll be able to let you know what we've got. The next webinar in the series is in January, and it is, as I said, on EBSNA. But we've also got webinars next term about body image, about academic stress, and we also run 2 complementary webinar series. So this is our series for education professionals in Trafford, but we also run an equivalent series for parents and carers across Trafford as well, and those kind of run in conjunction. So you're also very welcome to share details about our webinar offer with families if you think they would benefit. So we've done 2 webinars for families this term on anxiety and low mood, and then I believe next term we've got some on academic stress and various other topics coming up as well.
Yeah, so next half term for professionals, we've got one on low mood, one on academic stress, and our EBSNA webinar, which is with Trafford's EP service.
Just to say as well, if you have any parents or staff that have missed a webinar and you feel like they would be interested in a topic, they've been recorded, so feel free to contact our skill email address or pass that on to parents. Parents can access that email as well, and we can share the recording with them and some resources as well.
Right, we've had no further questions come through in the chat, so we'll give things just a last minute and then we'll end our event if that's okay with you, Kate and Bert.
Yeah, of course. I'll stop sharing because it's yeah, it's nice to see people again. It's very disconcerting not being able to see anybody. I always think everyone's left and I'm just me. So thank you so much for coming along.
Oh, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Yeah, okay, I'll just end the event. There we go. Mm.